In the heart of Florida's Big Cypress Preserve, where the air hums with cicadas and the ground breathes mist, two forgotten giants emerged from the wild. They weren't supposed to be there. And yet, they were haunted, hunted, and hoping. What happened over the next 3 days would bind the fate of humans and hippos in a way no one could have predicted. Before we begin, tell us, where are you listening to this story from? A quiet room? A busy street? Or maybe near nature like our tale? Share it in the comments below. It was early spring in southern Florida, and the skies above Big Cypress National Preserve hung low with mist and thunderclouds, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The swamp exhaled with slow, muddy groans, frogs croaked, and dragonflies skated just above the water's trembling surface. But beneath the cypress trees and mossy canopy, something had gone terribly wrong. The water had turned sour. It stank of chemicals and decay. Dead fish floated belly up in stagnant pools, and the once abundant chorus of swamp creatures had fallen silent. Milo, a robust male hippopotamus with thick gray skin and a broad scar running diagonally across his snout, stood half-submerged in a shrinking waterhole. His golden brown eyes, usually calm and unreadable, now flickered with unease. Near him lay Tala, his Mattia, smaller but strong-boned female, her rounded belly heavy with new life. She had patches of dried mud along her flank and breathed with quiet effort. The swamp was their home, not by nature, but by reintroduction, part of a now-defunct conservation program that had attempted to house non-native hippos in isolated parts of the southern wetlands decades ago. Most had died or been relocated. Milo and Tala had survived. But now, even survival had turned uncertain. Weeks of subtle poisoning had crept into the ecosystem. The usual snake trails had disappeared. The alligators had gone first, then the turtles. And now, even the herons no longer skimmed the surface. Milo had noticed the signs long before Tala, watching fish rot midstream, watching insects swarm in unusual patterns. When Tala began to limp and refused food, he knew they had to leave. It wasn't instinct, it was desperation. The soil no longer cooled their bellies. The reeds no longer shaded them from the sun. The land that had once cradled them now betrayed them. On the third day of their journey, they crossed overland through shallow marshes and dry, cracked clay beds. The sun was cruel. Tala's movements were slower than usual. She was pregnant, close to term, and her breathing was labored. Her eyes were dulled from the heat and constant effort. Milo often stopped to wait, standing behind her like a guardian shadow. Twice, she collapsed from exhaustion, once near a fallen palmetto, where biting flies swarmed around them, and once beside a thin creek, where she simply slid to her knees and could not rise again. Milo circled her, sniffed her body, then gently took a mouthful of the vines tangled around her back legs and pulled. He didn't roar. He didn't panic. He simply stayed. When she didn't move, he pressed his massive head under her shoulder and nudged, slowly, carefully, as if saying, "We go together or not at all." Elsewhere, over 70 miles northeast, near the Winding River Wildlife Refuge, an old man in a tan ranger's uniform stood leaning on the railing of a weather-beaten observation tower. His name was Walter Green, 60 years old, 6'2" with a barrel chest, and hands marked with old burn scars. Walter had served 3 decades as a city firefighter in Jacksonville, before retiring to the swamplands he'd fallen in love with during a rescue mission long ago. His eyes, pale blue and narrowed from years of smoke and heat, scanned the tree line below with practiced stillness. He was known among the younger rangers as the Quiet Oak, someone who said little, but when he did, you listened. Life had carved patience into him after the death of his wife 10 years prior. He no longer searched for meaning-only presence. Beside him, half hidden behind a large notebook and a pair of binoculars, was Clara Jenkinsa, 28-year-old wildlife biologist from Tallahassee, lean and sharp-minded, with chestnut brown skin and tightly coiled hair tied back into a functional ponytail. Clara was all motion, scribbling, observing, squinting at prints, muttering to herself. She had arrived at Winding River 3 months prior, part of a grant-funded research team documenting migratory anomalies in Florida's wetland mammals. But lately, her pages were filled with confusion. "Something's changed," she murmured. "Tracks out of place. Prey animals vanishing. I think something big's moving through." Walter gave a low grunt. Not disagreement, but permission for her to continue. Back in the mudflats, as a thunderstorm brewed in the far distance, Milo and Tala crested a shallow rise. Tala stumbled again. This time she groaned, a long, low sound that echoed off the mossy trees like a foghorn in a ghost town. She didn't rise immediately. Milo turned and pressed against her side, lips brushing her cheek. Then he stood over her, shielding her from the sun. Rain began to fall warm and sporadic, a blessing and a warning. They had traveled for nearly a week. Tala was on the edge of collapse. Yet in that moment, Milo didn't give in to fear. He waited. The storm rolled closer. In the observation tower, Clara adjusted her binoculars. "There," she said sharply. "West End movement. 2 large figures. Not deer, not bear. Way too wide." Walter squinted. "Could be feral cows," he muttered. Clara shook her head. "No, one of them is limping, and it's shaped wrong, like it's dragging something, or protecting something." She lowered the glasses. "I need to see this up close." The next morning, the mud held new stories. 2 wide trails cut through the marshes like scars across the land. Walter traced them with his boot. "Not gator, not boar," he muttered. These are wide." Clara knelt beside him. "And heavy. One's lighter, one's bigger. The lighter one drags every 20 feet. See here?" Her voice trembled slightly. "I think it's giving birth." Walter looked at her hard. "A birthing animal on the move? That's suicide." Clara stood slowly. "Not if it has a reason. Not if it's running from something worse." What neither of them knew yet was that Milo and Tala weren't just running, they were surviving. And with each step through the hostile swamp, they were writing a new kind of legend. One not of prey and predator, but of love, endurance, and quiet heroism beneath the cypress moon. By late afternoon, the storm clouds had broken into a light drizzle, casting a hazy glow over the Winding River Preserve. The swamp pulsed with new life after the rain frogs croaked more confidently, and the leaves shimmered with drops that clung like dew to the cypress knees. But Clara Jenkins wasn't admiring the beauty of the landscape. She was crouched at the edge of a muddy embankment, staring at a deep, rounded impression in the earth. It was wide, unnaturally so, and beside it ran a dragging mark as if something immense had trudged through, its weight pulling it closer to the earth with each step. She ran her fingers along the rim of the print. Still wet, still fresh. Walter Green stood a few feet behind her, his arms crossed over his chest, a skeptical look on his weathered face. His boots were caked in muck, and his posture leaned just slightly to the right, a remnant of an old spinal injury from a house collapse decades ago. "You sure that's what you think it is?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Clara looked up at him, eyes steady beneath the brim of her soaked baseball cap. "I'm not just sure," she said. "I'm certain. These are hippo tracks, one large male, one smaller female. And that drag mark? She's not walking right. She might be in labor, or injured." Walter exhaled through his nose. "Hippopotamuses don't belong here," he muttered. "Not anymore. They were all cleared out in the 90s. Relocated to private sanctuaries or sent overseas. No way a pair just strolls back in like they own the place." Clara rose, brushing mud from her knees. "Or maybe they never left. Maybe someone forgot one. Maybe 2 survived. Either way, they're here now, and they're in trouble." At the same time, Not far from the narrow reed channel that curved into the northern boundary of the preserve, Milo and Tala had found a shallow cove. The water was clearer than anything they'd touched in days. Tala stepped in slowly, her limbs trembling, then collapsed with a groan into the cooler shallows. Milo stood beside her, tail twitching anxiously. Her breathing was sharp now, chest rising in rapid bursts, and her swollen sides quivered with tension. Milo nudged her gently with his snout. She didn't rise. Back on the trail, Clara and Walter had begun to follow the path. Clara carried a camera, her notebook, and a canvas pouch slung over her shoulder filled with field tools and a small first aid kit. Walter carried nothing but a worn pair of binoculars and a walking-stickin' old pine branch, sanded smooth and carved with initials, a gift from his late wife. The farther they moved, the more unusual the signs became. Flattened bushes, claw marks on tree trunks, and once, a puddle of blood, tinged water near a shallow bend. Clara knelt beside it, heart clenching. "This isn't just travel fatigue," she whispered. "This female is in distress." Walter's face hardened. If she dies out here, then their whole escape, whatever they were running from, will have been for nothing. All this distance, just to collapse at the edge of safety. His voice was quiet, almost tender, but it carried weight. Clara glanced at him, surprised by the emotion behind the words. Walter didn't speak of loss often, but when he did, it came like thunder behind the clouds. They pressed forward. Near the end of the marsh line, past a dead cypress that leaned like an old watchman over the swamp, they caught their first glimpse of movement. A wide gray mass, half submerged. Clara raised her binoculars, breath catching in her throat. There, by the bend, 2 hippos. She's down. He's guarding her. Oh God, she's not moving. She turned to Walter. "We need to get closer." Walter didn't argue. Step by slow step, they approached. Milo raised his head as they came into view. His ears flinched. He didn't growl, didn't charge, but his body tensed, muscles rippling under thick hide, a wall of instinct and power. Clara crouched low, hands visible, her voice calm and slow. "We're not here to hurt you. We just want to help." Tala shifted, moaned again, and something in the sound made Walter's chest tighten. It wasn't just pain, it was fear, the same fear he'd heard from trapped mothers during his years in fire rescues. A primal cry. Clara whispered. "She's in early labor, but it's not progressing, and she's weak. Too weak." She reached into her pouch, pulled out a small vial of veterinary-grade oxytocin, a drug used to induce contractions. "If we wait, she'll either miscarry or bleed out. I have 1 dose." Walter looked at her, then at the massive creature lying in the reeds, flanks rising like soft hills. "Can you reach her?" he asked. Clara nodded. "I'll try, but only if you keep him back." Walter stepped forward, raising both arms. "All right, big guy," he said softly, addressing Milo. "Let's make a deal. She lives, the baby lives. That's all we want." Milo didn't move, but he didn't advance either. Clara stepped closer, her boots sinking with each step. She could hear Tala's breathing now, erratic and shallow. She spoke as she walked, murmuring soft reassurances, the kind her grandmother used to whisper while tending animals back in her childhood farm in rural Georgia. As she reached Tala's side, Clara saw the tension in the hippo's eyes, but there was no fight left, only hope. Clara administered the injection swiftly, then backed away. They waited. The wind picked up, rippling through the trees like applause. And beneath the veil of hanging moss, a miracle quietly began. Night fell like a weighted curtain over winding river. The light rain had stopped, but the air was thick with humidity and mosquitoes that danced in ghostly swarms above the reeds. A full moon broke through the cloud line and cast a silver sheen across the flooded grasslands. Frogs croaked distantly, but near the bend where Tala lay, it was near silent only. The labored breaths of a dying mother, the low rumble of her mate, and the occasional soft command from two humans trying to defy nature's cruel clock. Tala had not moved in nearly an hour. Her side still rose and fell, but more slowly now. Blood, dark and sticky, had spread into the water like ink. The oxytocin had done its job. Contractions had intensified, but the baby wasn't coming. Clara crouched a few feet away, scribbling notes with trembling hands. She had seen a lot in her short but intense career, but nothing like this. Her curls were damp with sweat and dew, her lips pressed into a tight line. Every instinct in her screamed for action, but every protocol reminded her of the razor-thin line between help and harm. Walter stood behind her, flashlight beam trained on Tala's flank. His face was unreadable, the way only men who had held dying bodies could be. "We're losing her," he said quietly. "That bleeding's internal. She's been in labor too long." Clara nodded. "We can't sedate. She won't survive it. And if we knock her out, the calf might never take its first breath." She opened her field kit, hands hovering over the small set of emergency tools: gloves, gauze, a cauterizing iron, a portable oxygen tank. "I could try a manual extraction, reach in, guide the calf's shoulders, but if she thrashes, or if he—" She glanced at Milo, who stood less than 20 feet away, watching with rigid tension. "If he sees me touch her again, it could turn violent." Walter's voice was low but steady. "He knows. He's been watching. He's not dumb, Clara. He's waiting to see if we're enemy or miracle." Clara swallowed hard. "And if we get it wrong?" Walter didn't answer. Tala groaned again, weaker this time. Her eyes rolled back for a moment, and she shifted just enough to let out a long exhale, as though surrendering to something deeper than pain. Milo responded immediately. He stepped forward, his bulk sloshing through the shallow water. His nostrils flared, ears flicked, and with one deep-chested growl, he planted himself directly between the humans and his mate. His massive head lowered, jaws twitching, the message unmistakable. "Back off," Walter whispered, raising a hand. "Let's give him a moment." They retreated 2 steps. Clara crouched lower, trying not to breathe too loudly. Her fingers clutched the gloves in her hand, knuckles white. The moonlight danced across Milo's back as he leaned down, nudging Tala with his snout, emitting a series of low, breathy grunts, almost like a song. Clara had seen elephants do this in mourning, whales when calling to calves. Milo wasn't threatening. He was pleading. Tala didn't answer. Then, in a movement so slow and measured it was almost surreal, Milo stepped back. Just 1 step. But it was enough. His head turned slightly toward Clara. A signal, or perhaps a surrender. Clara looked at Walter. "That's it. That's my window. Go," he said. She moved forward on her knees, inch by inch. Milo held his ground, but didn't advance. Tala's body was trembling, her breathing shallow. Clara slid on gloves, then gently pressed her hands against the hippo's belly. She could feel the tightening, the resistance. The calf was stuck, shoulders misaligned, blocking the birth canal. Her hands moved with the memory of her grandmother's words, spoken not to hippos, but to terrified farm girls delivering calves during hurricane season. "Be gentler than God, stronger than fear." "Okay, girl," Clara murmured. "You don't know me, but I know what it means to fight to live." She reached into the birth canal, fingers brushing against slick, unmoving skin. Carefully, she repositioned the calf's forelimbs, rotated slightly, and with a firm pull, guided the shoulders forward. Tala let out a choking gasp, and blood surged around Clara's arms. But then a movement, a shift, and with a final contraction, the calf slipped free into the water, limp and silent. Clara scrambled to support it, turning it so its head was above water. "Breathe, baby. Come on. Come on." She rubbed its side, clearing mucus from its nostrils. It coughed, twitched, then let out a sharp, whimpering squeal. Clara sobbed. "Yes, yes." Walter exhaled audibly, stepping forward with a towel. "Wrap him. Dry him." Milo moved instantly, brushing Clara aside with the gentlest nudge of his head and placing his bulk between her and the calf. He lowered his snout, licked the calf's back. Tala stirred, eyes opening just enough to see her newborn. She groaned softly and reached her head forward, touching noses. Clara backed away, soaked in blood and water, trembling with 1,000 emotions. Walter helped her to her feet, steadying her. "You did it, kid!" "No," she said, voice cracking. "She did." The pale dawn broke slowly over winding river, painting streaks of orange and pink across the fog-draped canopy. The swamp, so often cloaked in shadow and silence, seemed to exhale after a long-held breath. Birds called cautiously from the treetops, and dragonflies skimmed the water in lazy loops. But in a shallow basin of reeds and dark water, something sacred had just unfolded. The calf had arrived. Clara Jenkins stood knee-deep in muck, her arms still trembling, blood-streaked and shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. Her dark brown eyes were locked on the newborn hippo, lying half-submerged near its mother. At first, it had been silent, too silent, and those 10 seconds had felt like eternity. But then, a weak groan broke the stillness, followed by a flutter of its tiny ears and a twitch of its tail. Clara had never cried during fieldwork before. She had seen births in labs and rescues in shelters, but this was raw, primal, and untouched by the human world. Milo had been the first to respond. The massive bull had surged forward with surprising grace, placing his broad body protectively around the calf. He lowered his head and began licking it gently, first its back, then its face, each movement full of reverence. His entire posture softened, as if the weight of days, of survival, of watching Tala suffer, had lifted. Clara watched as the newborn nestled against its mother's flank, instinctively seeking warmth. Tala, barely conscious, lifted her head just enough to lay her chin on her child's back. Her breath was shallow, but her eyes, half-lidded, glimmered with something unmistakable peace. Behind Clara, Walter Green slowly sank to the ground. His jeans soaked through with swamp water, and his shoulders slumped forward. He sat silently in the reeds. His silver hair clung to his forehead, his jaw clenched. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I used to think only firefighters got the privilege of bringing life out of the jaws of hell, but nature's got its own kind of fire." His hands trembled, and one tear escaped down his weathered cheek. The stillness was broken by the soft rustle of brush behind them. A third figure emerged. Delaney Moore, 54, the head ranger of Winding River. Delaney was tall and broad-shouldered, with freckles across her sun-aged skin and short-cropped red hair. Her face was stern by default, the kind earned through decades of wrangling both wild animals and federal paperwork. But her eyes, a piercing gray, softened when she saw the scene before her. She approached with careful steps, stopping beside Walter. "You didn't call this in," she said quietly, though there was no anger in her tone. Walter didn't look at her. "Didn't have time?" Delaney took a slow breath, then turned to Clara. "What do we have?" Clara straightened up slightly. "A healthy male calf, born under stress, but he's breathing, nursing. Mother's weak, losing blood, but stable for now. We need fluids, electrolytes. Maybe a wound flush if we can manage it without sedating." Delaney nodded, her eyes never leaving the small family before her. "I'll call in supplies from the North Station. But Clara, if this hits the press, we'll have helicopters over our heads by sunset." Clara's jaw tightened. "Then we keep it quiet. For now, they've earned peace." Delaney agreed with a short nod and turned back toward the trail to radio her team. As she disappeared into the trees, Walter shifted and looked over at Clara. "What are you going to name him?" She blinked. "I thought maybe the mother should decide that." Walter snorted softly. "She already did. She chose to live." Then, after a beat, "How about Harvey?" Clara tilted her head. "Why Harvey?" Named after the storm that wrecked my hometown back in '99, Walter said. It was destruction, but it also brought people together, forced us to start over. This little guy's kind of like that, ain't he? Clara smiled for the first time in hours. Harvey it is. As the sun rose higher, Harvey began to find his legs. They were wobbly, more instinct than strength, but each step was a small miracle. Milo stayed close, guiding the calf with gentle nudges, while Tala rested with her head against a mound of moss. Every now and then, she opened one eye and watched her baby stumble and sway, each movement a triumph of life over the odds. By mid-morning, the preserve felt different, not just quieter but reverent, as if the entire swamp knew what had happened and was holding space for it. Clara sat beside Walter again, exhausted, mud-caked, and hollowed out in the most beautiful way. "We should go soon," she said, glancing back at the trio. "Give them space, but I'd like to check in on them tomorrow." Walter looked at her and nodded. "We'll come back," quietly. As they rose and began the slow trek back to the observation trail, Clara turned for one last look. Milo was lying beside Tala now, their bodies curled gently around Harvey, who had finally collapsed into a deep sleep. Clara didn't need to hear any words to know what was exchanged in that moment. It was the universal language of survival, of trust, of choosing to stay when everything says run. The days that followed Harvey's birth melted into a rhythm of quiet wonder. In the mornings, soft fog hovered above the riverbanks, like a curtain drawn by angels, and the cypress trees stood solemn, bearing silent witness to the new family nestled along the bend. Milo, once a wall of muscle and wariness, had softened into a vigilant guardian. Tala, though still regaining her strength, nursed and nuzzled with a grace that defied the rawness of her near-death labor. And Harvey, awkward, alive, had become the center of it all. Clara Jenkins returned daily, always just after sunrise. She brought fruit, fresh water, and vitamins discreetly tucked into piles of greens. She never crossed the invisible line that Milo had drawn on she now honored like sacred ground. Instead, she sat at a respectful distance with her notebook open on her lap and a thermos of black coffee in hand. Her curls frizzed wildly in the morning humidity, and the knees of her field pants were permanently stained. But she didn't care. She had never been more herself than here, in this wild cathedral where everything was reborn. Walter Green joined her every few days. He didn't say much, as usual. His presence was steady, like a rock sunk deep in river silt. He'd sit in his canvas folding chair, hat low over his eyes, and grunt quietly when Harvey did something new, like chase a frog with wide-eyed determination, or dip his entire head underwater and snort like he'd discovered a new language. "He's got fire," Walter once said, the corner of his mouth lifting. Not like his dad, more playful, but just as stubborn. The news of the birth had, as expected, begun to ripple through the conservation community. Delaney Moore, the head ranger, had been cautious but firm. "We're not turning this into a zoo," she'd told a visiting journalist from a Florida wildlife blog who begged for a photo. Delaney, tough as cypress bark, but with a soul tuned to the quiet frequencies of the forest, had put her foot down. They didn't survive all this to be put on postcards. By the third week, Harvey had begun to venture farther from his mother, wading deeper into the river's edge and testing the buoyancy of his small body. Clara watched him one afternoon as he playfully gnawed on a clump of duckweed, then flailed backward when a startled heron flapped its wings. He bolted back to Tala's side, then, moments later, peeked from behind her with cautious curiosity. Clara laughed softly, scribbling in her journal. She wrote, "He learns fear and courage by the hour. He forgets just enough to try again." Later that evening, under a bronze sunset, she sat alone on the old observation deck overlooking the marsh. The wind was warm, carrying the scent of peat and blooming elderberries. Her fingers moved slowly over the journal page, not recording data but something far more personal. She wrote, "This swamp was once just a blur on a map. Now it's a heart beating in the mud, Harvey didn't just survive. He brought something ancient back to life in them, in us. She paused, then added, "This place isn't just full of water and teeth. It holds memory. And now, it holds Harvey." That same night, Milo led Harvey down a muddy slope toward the deeper waters, guiding him as only a father could. Tala followed behind, slower but steady. Walter and Clara, watching from the trail, said nothing. The hippos entered the water like ghosts, returning to a home they never forgot. Milo turned once, locking eyes with Clara. Not fear, not challenge, just something quietly grateful. 2 weeks later, the preserve held a small gathering. No press, no cameras, just rangers, volunteers, and a few locals who had helped clear invasive brush that spring. It was Delaney's idea, a symbolic naming, a ritual to root Harvey into the story of Winding River. Clara stood in front of the group with her journal in hand. Her voice, though soft, carried over the reeds. He was born in pain, in blood, in mud, but also in love, in patience, and in defiance of every reason not to live. We named him Harvey, which means battle-worthy or heart of iron. But I think he's more than that. He's hope that learned to walk. The group fell silent for a moment, then nodded, quietly moved. Nearby, Milo's low grunt echoed through the trees like a blessing. That night, after the others had gone, Clara remained behind. Alone now, she sat by the water where Harvey had first touched earth. The stars shimmered above, brighter than usual. Crickets sang. The water lapped gently at the shore. From across the bend, Milo and Tala lay curled around Harvey, their massive bodies pressed into the grass. Harvey blinked sleepily, his head resting on his mother's side. Clara opened her journal one last time that day. With a shaky hand and full heart, she wrote, "The swamp is no longer just a place of mud and silence. It is the place where a soul was born between the wild and the beating heart of those who dared to believe in him." Sometimes, life fights hardest to be born when the world gives it the least chance. In the mud, in the pain, in the silence of the swamp, a tiny heartbeat can remind us that survival is not just instinct, it's love, resilience, and trust. Whether in animals or people, the will to live is often carried by those who choose to stay, to fight, and to believe, even in the wildest, most unlikely places. If this story touched you, share your thoughts with us. Tell us what part moved you most. And if you believe more people should hear stories of hope between humans and the wild, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps keep these voices alive.